Lojban. So I'm Lojban Bob, but it's Lojban is what everybody calls me now. This is my wife Nora, hiding behind the thing. She and I met each other through working on lowland before it was Lojban. We are two of the four co-leaders of the Lojban project, co-founders they call it. The third one's a guy named Gary Burgess who lives down in Hampton. We're actually going to be visiting him this weekend. And the fourth one lives up in the east here, a guy named Tony Whitlock. And we got involved in the language, well, at various times for various reasons. Nora's been involved with lowland since 1975 or 76, and she actually became interested in language back when they had a Scientific American article back in 1960. I didn't get involved at all. I'm not a linguist. I wasn't particularly interested in linguistics. And the friend of mine, Gary Burgess, came and visited me out in California and said, there's this guy named James Cook Brown who lives near here, and I'm calling him up. And so he ended up using me as transportation. We went over, and I got involved. So, yes. We've heard that you guys have read a lot of Erica Hochman's book, which has a pretty good history about how it came about, so I'm not going to spend any more time with that. You won't find, my version of it would probably be more slanted than hers. She does, there's nothing really wrong with what she says. So. I'm not much of a public speaker, as you may tell. I stutter a little bit. So we'll start, I'll talk a little bit, but I'd really like to make this more conversational, let you guys ask questions. Feel free to deviate from whatever questions I'm prepared for, because we're pretty good at winging it if we have to. Looking at your questions, I saw kind of two categories of questions that really came to mind. One was a general question about how we got it, how things came about, how come we did this, how come we did that, why the language was designed certain ways. And I'll try to answer that in general. And the other type of question was more a question of how hard is the language in terms of certain features, learning vocabulary, learning the logic, learning this particular part. What was hard about the language, and how successful it's been? Do we have fluent speakers? To answer that question, by the way, we do have fluent speakers. We've had one of our most fluent our first fluent speaker was a guy named Nick Nicholas way back in the 1990s. And he lives in Australia, and he was a native speaker of Greek, one of the Greek immigrants. So he's actually come and visited us here, but he ended up going into linguistics as a result of Lojban. But he was sitting there, and what ended up happening is I think he got drunk one day talking to some other Lojbanists and ended up trying to speak Lojban. And he was speaking fluently because he was relaxed. I can speak Lojban. So I started speaking Lojban for an hour. More recently, we have a whole bunch of, we've gotten a lot of other people. There's probably the second fluent speaker was a guy named Jorge Chambillas, who's Argentinian. He studied up in Pittsburgh, got his degree there, and went back to Argentina. And he ended up just acquiring enough skill with the language, and he's good enough with languages that he just suddenly was talking the language. He actually goes and corrects everybody else. And he translated the Alice in Wonderland into Lojban. Actually, a whole bunch of people worked on it, but he ended up going through the whole thing and finalizing it. Translating Alice in Wonderland into Lojban is not a trivial thing. There's a lot of puns in there, and translating puns becomes complicated, but he managed to do a reasonably fair job of it. More recently, probably the current most fluent speaker is a man named Robin Powell. He's Canadian, lives in California. About a year and a half ago, he had twin daughters. Since then, he's been speaking to them only in Lojban.
Wow, really?
So hopefully, sometime, anytime now, we'll have our first Lojban native speaker.
Their mother
speaks in English. It's not a big experiment that is going to risk damaging children. But he speaks only Lojban. How well does he speak Lojban? He's speaking to infants. they don't necessarily understand what he's saying. And whatever he's saying to them, he's probably talking to them about things that you talk about to infants. I adopted a couple of kids from Russia in 1992. One of them is my daughter, Angela, who's right over there in the audience. They spoke only Russian when we got them. And I had studied Russian a little bit on my own to try to make them understand us and whatever. I spoke to them in Russian, and by the end of a couple of months, I was speaking fluent 6-year-old Russian. I could speak to them about almost anything without a dictionary, and we could have a little bit of a conversation. I was kind of tongue-tied with some vocabulary. It was mostly fluent. I couldn't talk to an adult about anything. If an adult talked to me, they'd have to talk slowly, repeat themselves, explain several words. Was I fluent? Not really. I wasn't fluent in Russian. I was fluent in 6-year-old Russian. Robin may be fluent in infant Lojban. We don't know. Actually, he's actually fairly good at speaking Lojban to other people to the extent that other people can understand it. He's also written, a couple hundred pages of what may be the first Lojban novel, which is somewhere up on our website. Finding things on our website I know is a pain, but so we have fluent speakers. The vocabulary of the language is sufficient for fairly fluent speech. I did a quick look in the online dictionary, and we probably have about 10,000 words in there. Nobody's learned 10,000 words, and in fact, most of those words are not particularly useful. One time we did a project to try to build the vocabulary and came up with some words for topics. So we came up with 5 different words to say this, and they all ended up in the dictionary. And they're not necessarily things that are particularly useful words. So we have 5 different words for some obscure topic, not particularly useful. And I think there's some names counted in that and stuff like that. So do we have enough words? We'll never know. The nice thing about Lojban is kind of freely extensible. You can make up words as you go. It's designed to make up words as you go and have those words be understood. I don't know how, I would say people in general are able to understand the words by taking apart their pieces, and you kind of figure, what does future adjacent day mean? Well, that means tomorrow. So we have, you learn Bavlamde. Bavlamde is the word. Bav means future, is an affix for future. Lam is the affix for lamchi, for adjacent. Day is the affix for jetty, which is day. Future adjacent day, okay? Now, figuring out how to use that word can be a little bit more complicated, but at least you get the basic meaning. And for understanding, for recognizing words, that's all you need. Learning to read Lojban isn't particularly difficult at all, as long as you've got access to a word list or you can look the words up and you can take the pieces apart. Reading it is probably the easiest thing to do. There are 2 skills in learning a language which are very distinct. One is recognizing words, and the other is recalling them. I want the word for ribbon. Okay, ribbon. It's Dostry. Okay, I remembered that one. But if I want the word for something, and I may not even know it, if I don't know that it's in the list of words that we've got a translation for, I want the word for next week. I can invent a word for next week pretty easily, but I don't know the word, and recalling the word, therefore, is not something easy. And to be fluent, you've got to be able to recall. To be fluent as a speaker, you've got to be able to recall words as you need them. So becoming fluent can be difficult.
No. He didn't bring these correct glasses, so you can't.
Okay. There was a question about non-native speakers. I mentioned Jorge and Nick, who is technically native Greek, although I don't know how much Greek he actually spoke, he ended up doing his PhD thesis on Greek, so he obviously knows Greek fairly well. But as far as we have, I'd say probably about 20 to 40% of the Lojban community is international, non-native speaker. Pretty much all the ones that I know are English speakers, because nobody ever talks to me in only English while they talk in English, so I don't really know them. Recently I found out that apparently there's a couple of hundred Japanese in a community all off on their own. They don't interact with us, speaking that are apparently working with Lojban. How do they speak? We don't know. They may be fluent, they may not. They may be, I understand you have a kind of a Lojban club here or whatever, they may be at that level, or they may be more advanced. When one of them speaks Lojban to me, then I'll know that they speak Lojban. But I just found out that there are 200 Japanese. We didn't know there were any Japanese students of Lojban until a couple of weeks ago. There's apparently another group in Russia and a group in China. I knew there was some people in China learning independently of us. One of the things I think is important about an artificial language really being a language is that it be speakable by people other than the person who invented it. If I'm the only one who speaks it, and I only speak to people who I've taught the language, how much is it, do they know the language, or how much is it really that they just know me? In general, I think we've gone beyond that. We managed to write. Nora wrote some initial language tools. We then wrote a textbook, which almost nobody ever looks at anymore, because what happened is that then John Callan wrote the reference grammar of complete Lojban language, which I understand you got to read a little bit of. We have a couple. We have copies here. If anybody wanted to buy one and not buy a mail order, I didn't actually. They're in the car or whatever. But somebody who really wanted a copy, you can get it without paying for postage. But at any rate, with this.
Nevertheless, it's a version of it is online, so that's free.
Yes, we aren't bothered with it. Go ahead and read it. It's in print. It's 660 pages with a 60-page index. So you can find almost anything you want in it, and it's very well organized because of that. But it completely covers the language. I have read books about English that purport to cover English, and they're fine print, and it's 1,000 pages, and they say this, there's all these exceptions we're not covering. A description of the Lojban language grammar takes about, I think it's about 300 rules was what we ended up with. 300 may sound like a lot. The few attempts they've made to come up with something approaching an English parser that covers rules for the language has about 50,000 rules, and it doesn't cover everything. So I think we've got a very simple language. Learning Lojban, learning the rules of Lojban, compared to learning any natural language is incredibly easier. So learning Lojban is really not a question of learning grammar. One of the questions was how hard is the logic to learn? Well, if you learn, in order to learn the language at all, you've got to learn a couple of basic principles of logic. You have to know what a predicate is. And it can be a little bit hard to understand that, but that's covered in the Red Book. By the way, in addition to the Red Book, I was going to say Nick Nicholas, that first fluent speaker, actually wrote a textbook, which is probably better for someone just starting out learning the language. And there's a pointer to the textbook on the web page under books, and it's written in a more. It doesn't cover the whole language, but it covers the introductory concepts with lots of examples. It gives you a couple of exercises, so you can actually feel whether you understand what you're reading and whatever. And I rather strongly recommend it. People seem to learn a fair amount from that. But anyway, I wrote my own textbook, or I wrote part of it, and found out that I didn't know how to write a textbook. And I rewrote it and found out I didn't have the stick-with-it-ness to finish a textbook. So I have two partial textbooks that will probably never get finished. Nick finished his, and it's reasonably good. The main thing, I think, that people struggle with learning Lojban is what they struggle with learning every language. I mean, there's some amount of, well, if you're trying to deal with Arabic, you've got to learn a weird alphabet, and that can be a problem. With Chinese, you've got to learn the tone system. But with pretty much every language you learn, you've got to learn vocabulary. And from pretty much what my experience is and from what I've heard from other people, that's ultimately the bottom line going to be the most difficult thing in learning Lojban or learning Spanish or learning Russian. If you are learning something like Spanish, it's thought to be easier for an English speaker because so many of the words are cognate. You recognize that a lot of the words are very similar to the English words, or they're similar to a word that means something related to that in English, so you can learn it fairly easily. You get to a language like Russian, it's a little bit harder because the vocabulary is written in Cyrillic, which most people don't know how to read. If you learn Cyrillic, it ends up being a lot easier, and it turns out that a lot of the same roots are there. There's a few more different roots than in Spanish, but then you end up finding things that are very much like English. The example I was just using earlier with your professor was the word nahodi, which is to find. It literally translates in English to come upon. And when you look, and it turns out that a large number of Russian words that are hard to learn are really easy to learn because you can take them apart into what end up being English idioms, and you recognize the idiom and say, oh, this isn't so hard. So Russian ends up being easier than you think it is until you start trying to deal with inflections and stuff like that. But the vocabulary is certain amount of difficult. Learning Chinese has no, you're not going to have any hooks in English at all. They have almost no words that look like English, so it'll be a little bit harder still. But the bottom line is, to speak Chinese or Spanish or whatever and have any degree of fluency, you're going to have to be able to come up with a couple thousand words maybe. And learning a couple of thousand words is not going to be easy. Learning a couple of thousand words to recognize them in print, to be able to read Spanish, ends up being relatively easy because you're going to recognize the words. You're going to see, oh, this looks like that word, and you're going to know what it means. Recalling them and speaking it is a little bit harder. The problem when you're getting to try to recall words when you don't know anything about them ends up being a bit more difficult, and you just got to come out with 2,000, 3,000 words. We ended up doing a flashcard program way back in 1986. That was kind of how we got started together. It was just an MS-DOS program that drills you to death in the words, and we learned 1,300 words in about 2 months by doing about an hour-a-day work. And for a while there, well, in fact, we celebrated our honeymoon 25 years ago here at Colonial Williamsburg. That was when we first spoke Lojban to each other. We ended up for 2 hours. She had a couple hundred words of vocabulary that she'd used using the flashcard. I had 200 different words because we weren't using this. We were in the same place in the program. And we ended up talking for 2 hours, and not exactly, it wasn't anything like fluent, but we managed to communicate, and we stuck entirely to the language, and we felt like we accomplished a great deal. And it got us motivated enough that we kept going, and so Lojban exists as a result. But you can probably learn maybe, well, like a typical textbook, a Spanish or Russian textbook is going to teach you 1,000 words in the first year. So you take like 3 years of Spanish, you're going to know 3,000 words. How good are you at 3,000 words? That depends on how well you use it, on how well you work at it, but if you practice, you can do a fair amount. A typical junior high school student in America knows about 10,000 words. College students like you guys probably know at least 15,000 that you can use actively, and you probably recognize a whole bunch more. The typical English dictionary might have 100,000 or 300,000 words. Nobody memorizes 100,000 words. They're not going to memorize in English, they're not going to memorize in Lojban. So it comes down to how well you can put words together, and in English you can kind of make up words as you go, and they usually end up being legitimate English words. You can do the same with Lojban. You can make up the words you need to use as you do it, and it's a question of, do you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish? Do you communicate?
One thing I want to mention is one of the questions was about, find the exact question. Can you add words?
Yes, can you?
Yes, you can make up words based, as we did for tomorrow.
Yes.
But you can, we also have a space reserved in the grammatical words, schmabo. We have space reserved for experimental ones. So yes, you can add any of any type.
And people have done so. There are, I can't really give you a lot of examples of them, but there are some out there, and they'll even talk, if you go look for experimental schmabo, you'll find it. I see somebody who had a question there.
Oh, yeah. I saw that you used the Yak parser. I don't know if you did it or someone else to parse Lojban into what I assume would be like syntax trees. But I was wondering if has there been anything done with sort of like modeling meaning with that, and trying to move from what people say to how did that go? Just I'm interested.
Okay, I think I can deal with that one. Okay. When JCB first started, there weren't, computers didn't really exist. The amount of, the only thing, up until the time that 1954, and there really, computers weren't freely available even a few years later. In terms of designing Lojban, about all he used computers for was, his first dictionary consisted of sorted punch cards. And in fact, if you find a copy of what's called Lojban 1, his first dictionary, that's exactly what it looks like. Sorted punch cards printed on several pages. Not particularly impressive.
These days.
Yeah. Sometime in the 1960s, as a result of Chomsky's work, the whole idea of being able to analyze language in terms of rules became popular. And there was a South African linguist whose name I cannot recall, who got into a certain kind of analysis of grammar. And JCB started trying to analyze Lojban in those terms. It turned out somebody recognized along around the mid-70s, somebody recognized that what he was doing was somewhat similar to computer parsers. And in fact, similar to the kind of rules that are used in Yak. And this guy named Sheldon Linker made the first attempt to come up with a description of Lojban using Yak as a set of rules. JCB found that this was unsatisfying. The grammar that Sheldon Linker came up with did not end up didn't divide words up in a tree very much like JCB thought of it. So he thought about the language having a human grammar and a machine grammar, and they were distinct things. And that was basically about where things stand. He acquired, by 1984 or so, they had gotten the Lojban project up to the point where they could take a corpus of designed Lojban sentences and get them to parse, and have the parser would create a tree that looked like JCB thought it should. But it did so using a few tricks which were specific to Yak. One of the things we have in Yak that Yak uses is error processing. And if you've looked at much of the Lojban examples, you'll see that we have a lot of constructs that have terminators on the end of them. Those were put in to make Yak happy. And Yak requires pretty much, in order to be able to resolve the structure of the sentence, when you finish a structure, you've got to finish it so it knows to start the new structure. And it can't, and Yak does not look very far ahead, in fact only one word at a time, so it can't do a lot. Well, it turns out English speakers or natural language speakers can chunk in larger than one word at a time. They can look some number of tokens ahead and figure things out. We've had a couple of constructs that look more than one word ahead, and people are very unhappy because we've designed the language so it can be parsed by Yak, and therefore you end up having to put a terminator in that, so why do we need that terminator? It's perfectly obvious. And it turns out that it is from a human standpoint, but from a computer it isn't, at least not using YAC.
There are some terminators that are useful, that are needed, and if you think of mathematical equations, you've got parentheses that are needed. And the same is true in the language, but there are also ones that you don't need, that are superfluous, that once you start up a new thing, you can tell you're starting a new thing.
Yes, and in fact, well, I think there are people doing lessons now that I don't even know what they're doing. There's a lot of people doing stuff with language. Apparently, a lot of the new wave in teaching the language involves insisting when you start out that you put all the terminators in, which is not a very natural way of speaking Lojban, but you can do it, and it'll be perfectly understandable. And you learn the concept of how Lojban is built from structures into bigger structures very well. And then eventually you learn, okay, I can leave this one out. The end of the construct for a simple description is coup. So Levlanu coup is the blue thing. You can leave the coup out almost all the time, especially before the main verb of the sentence, the main predicate of the sentence. You can leave the coup out, but people end up that when they're learning, they need to put it in because you got to learn when it suddenly doesn't work to do that.
The YAC grammar, however, as we have it today, it does some error recovery and therefore can determine when the terminator can be aligned and when it can't. So you can pass the shorter forms through the grammar and have a look at it.
Yeah. Now Nora actually brought along a copy of the official parser, which we made sure that it worked before we started here, so we could actually, if somebody wanted to look at a couple of examples afterwards, or we can do that. I understand people have tried using the parsers online. There have been some efforts in coming up with parsers that were not YAC. There are other technologies and parsers that have been developed over the years that are not limited like YAC is, looking only one chunk ahead. And I don't know. I don't have the formal computer theory to know how these work, but I know some of them can look any number of tokens ahead, which is really what real language needs. We faked it out in the YAC grammar. They've done better, and they don't have to do faking it out. But I don't know. I don't even know the formal terminology for these grammars. The PEG grammar is PEG, and I don't know what it stands for. I think the current people think of that as being the best grammar for the language now, but it is not the official grammar because we've never verified that it is identical to the YAC grammar in terms of its effects. The language is still officially defined by the YAC grammar, which is the one that's found in the back of the
So, like, if the YAC grammar and the reference grammar text disagree on something, I don't know if they do, but if they did, which one is like the authoritative Lojban?
Well, the YAC grammar is actually part of the text.
Oh, I missed that.
It's described in the back.
The appendix has the YAC grammar in there.
Oh, cool.
It sounds like there's a disparity between creating a logical language that is sort of parsable by these computers and having humans speaking it and sort of shaping the language as they use it and sort of knowing when a sentence would end, for instance. Are there internal controls that Lojban has in order to sort of make sure that certain meanings are not changed over time because you have you have so many people from all over the world learning how to speak it, and certainly that's how linguistic change occurs, is by having lots of different people speaking a language. So how do you keep a very regular language regular?
Okay, I think I can handle that one. The YAC grammar has been fixed, and in fact we have had no official changes to the YAC grammar in, I think, since 1996 or 97. I mean, 16 years of no change. I don't think English is. There's changes in every language going on constantly. We've been relatively free of change. There's been exactly one official change to the language in the last 16 years, and it wasn't a grammatical change. It was a semantic change that doesn't change the YAC tree at all. It does change the semantics, and it changes it mostly in a formal semantic sense, not in an everyday sense. It turns out, the topic is called Horlo, so Xorlo. You can look at it online, you may understand what they're saying. I don't understand it. I invented language, and I don't understand this concept. I don't need to. It turns out, according to Jorge Chambillas, who's the one who came up with it.
Which is why it's called Horlo.
It used to be Jorge's Lojban was
Jorge's Lo.
Yeah, his
Lo is the particle that he's redefining.
So it ended up turning into his version, and it's kind of supplanted our original version. But according to him, pretty much, if I go here I am, I've learned the language, I can write anything I want using the version of the language that existed before, and it'll mean the same thing. The language hasn't really changed in that sense.
His idea, I believe, is that he has eased it up so that you have other ways of saying that also, rather than that he's changed something.
I guess I'm imagining that there are these girls who are learning Lojban natively, right? That they will internalize some rules that you have set out. You've set out certain rules explicitly in your grammar, but they're not learning the language through the grammar. They're learning it through talking with their father, right? Which could very well shape the way that they would speak it. So, do you sort of hope that speakers are compelled to shape their language to your authoritative texts, or are you hoping that it will sort of people will take it?
If I have to say, based on experience, that we have accomplished that, and that these people who have been learning Lojban, now of course they've learned English to learn our textbooks, whatever. Although I've seen that apparently somebody is translating this book into Chinese, but there are I think the textbook has actually been translated into Chinese. Obviously, somebody who's learning it without having any interaction with me is not. Any controls they're getting out of what they're reading, which is, if they're reading it in Chinese, they're going to be reading a Chinese version of it. If the controls work, if they are able to speak so that I can understand it, then obviously they've interpreted it closely enough. Will the language evolve a little as a result of that? It's possible.
I don't think that was his question. Tell me if I'm wrong. You're saying that the native speakers who don't know the yak grammar or something might pick up on something else and go a different direction with it.
Right. It just basically, do you hope that Lojban remains fixed? Right.
Okay. The answer to that question is that we attempted to freeze the language for 5 years back in 1997 when this book was still finished. We intended to hope in 5 years that we get some fluent speakers who would then use the language, and then those fluent speakers would totally in Lojban would discuss changes to the language and come up with a new red book which would describe the language they're speaking. And we thought that might be somewhat changed. Well, it's been 16 years since 1997. We have some fluent speakers. There have been a couple of random proposals made, but by English, but they're always made in English. They're not made in Lojban. Horlo is the only significant change that might reflect in how somebody explain that it does reflect how certain things are explained, even if it's really doesn't affect the way you use the language. And the effect of that turns out that people use one word more than another.
In addition, Bob's original thought was, we will invent it, we're going to freeze it for 5 years so people actually learn what's there rather than going off some direction. And then afterwards we will let usage decide. The answer to the question.
Yes.
However, the feedback we get from the community is, no, no. And they discuss to death any
Yeah, people do it. People in general don't want arbitrary change to the language, but they hate even more the idea that the language will drift without any authoritative change. So if there's going to be a change, it would have to be adopted by some I hate to call it a Lojban academy, like the French academy, in order to, if it gets adopted by some formal group, then it would be accepted therefore. I don't think there's, other than the couple of things that have been proposed, I don't think anything like that is going to be happening anytime soon. Once we get, if we got native speakers, they might come up with something, but I'm not sure that they will. I'm not sure they're going to come up with anything really strange.
I think they'll wind up getting corrected about like you getting corrected in your English classes when you're in elementary school.
And yet there is change in English usage over time. Mostly it's vocabulary. There's some change in grammar. I mean, the whom is pretty much dead for people of your generation. It was less so for my generation, but it's not gone even now. And that's, you can say that's a grammatical change that our use of our limited use of cases for pronouns in English is dying. It's not dead. Whether it dies or not, it's not really going to affect usage that much because people don't. It isn't something that comes up that often. I think the language will, over time, have a few more of those types of things, and you can call that language drift. I think more often than not, what's going to happen, there will be changes. Well, we've designed the language to allow multiple ways of doing things. I think that fluent speakers will do some things using parts of the language that non-fluent speakers don't use. The attitudinals, which I know there are a lot of questions on, I don't know how much we really want to talk about them. The attitudinals are an area where I think there's going to be a lot more usage of them by fluent speakers once they know them, once they get used to the idea of expressing attitudes, just using words, not using tone of voice, not using gestures.
Facial expressions.
And as an example of this, we can look at what's happened when you guys go texting. I don't even have a cell phone, so I don't really know texting that well. But I know there's LOL, okay? LOL is in Lojban is OHO. We have a word for it that conveys the meaning of it. It's an attitudinal. You can use it pretty much the same way you'd use it in that. We invented it 10 years before they were texting, but we have and all the attitudinals are a lot like the various smileys and abbreviations you use. A lot of the things that are done in texting are ways that they're non-standard English, but they still get the point across, and they're not really inconsistent with English. And I think that what will happen with Lojban when we get fluent speakers is there will be forms of usage that will emerge, like that have emerged in texting, where people will do things that feel comfortable to them that aren't necessarily the way that I would do it because I'm used to analyzing in terms of rules and from the standpoint of standard English.
And one of the purposes of putting the attitudinals in place and stressing that you use the attitudinals is to avoid the cultural piece that we would have to define. Oh, this means yes, that means no, that means I'm happy. Oh, wait a minute, maybe it means I'm nervous.
And then there's various hand signs. I mean, the various gestures can mean all kinds of different things. And so if you rely on those things, texting you end up having to have these things like LOL. You have some codes that pretty much are almost independent of language that get across what you're trying to say without tone of voice, without gestures. That's your way of communicating. Lojban tried to do all of that emotional communication using words, so that you can express the same thing in text that you can verbally.
Is it possible that these verbal expressions of certain emotions might take on a culture of their own that you're trying to avoid?
I'm sure that they will, because we didn't choose the set of attitudinals based on any specific culture. That was one of the things that came up before. I want to mention, how did we do that? How did we come up with the attitudinals? Well, JCB had a list, had a rather limited set. Maybe about 15 of them, and a couple of them were scales, ya, ye, yo, you, or something like that. I can't remember them but they were, the intensity was conveyed by the final letter. And we looked at that, and I started looking at, actually, when I was translating, I was finding all these Chinese words that were expressed, and I realized that they were attitudinals. They were little monosyllables that were interjected in sentences that conveyed ideas, and those were not the predicate word for surprise. And I realized that we got those words in English too, and I realized, okay, those are English attitudinals. Now, which ones do we need in Lojban? Well, so I started going through the Chinese dictionary, and I went through English, and I said, what are all the kinds that we have? And I just started making a list. And then I went to Roget's thesaurus, and I got a list of emotion words. And I said, can we convey all these? And I ended up coming up with, I don't know, maybe about 50 or 100 different emotion concepts that needed to be expressed. And then I came up with, I said, we can't spare that many words. So I said, well, we've got to be able to do this with scales. So with the intensity scales, and then we've got to be able to combine things. Certain types of emotions really can be expressed as combinations of other ones. And so by doing that, I reduced the number down to something more or less manageable. And in so doing, the system we came up with ended up being immensely powerful. We don't know how powerful it is. I'll get a couple of examples because it gets really interesting. But we end up, I don't know, we end up with, like, say, well, certainly every possible combination of two vowels, with or without an apostrophe, that's legally said in Lojban, has some attitudinal meaning. There's also some other words that can be treated as attitudinals, but let's say we've got 30 of them, okay? 30 different words, we have, and each of them has a negation form, which technically means the exact opposite of emotion, but exactly what that opposite is isn't necessarily logically consistent. And each of them has a scale. You feel it intensely, you feel it mildly, you feel it moderate, and there's a neutral, which says, I don't really feel anything on this scale. And we end up with it covering a lot of concepts. After a few years of people using this, they weren't happy with this, and they ended up proposing some other things, and a couple of words were added, a couple of ideas were added. And then we ended up adding some of this other thing, which as far as I know isn't found in any natural language.
We might not know, though.
We don't know.
We're really linguists.
And there are these 5 modifiers: Roha, Roha, Rohi, Roho, and Rohu, and then we added a 6th one, Reha. That was just added as an afterthought after we had the system. And Roha is social, and Rohe is mental. Yeah, Rohi is an emotional. We have an abbreviation.
It goes straight down.
Yes. And Roho is
Roha, Rohi, Roho is physical.
Physical, yeah. It's actually sexual.
And then Reha was later added, and that's spiritual.
Spiritual, yes.
So you can complain and eat it.
So, yes. Yeah, you can say, way Roha is a social complaint, and the way Ro has a mental complaint. Oh, I've studied too hard for this test. And heartache would be Rohi, way Rohi. And you can come up with your own meaning for way Roho, sexual. Roho is physical and Rohu is sexual. Okay. Okay.
We have some questions.
Okay.
Have you or someone else that you know ever been speaking Lojban in public and have someone else mistake it for another language? Did they ask you, oh, what language is that, or do they think it's something else?
I don't think they have, but my brother and I definitely have, because they speak it in public all the time, and especially us growing up. They would just, I mean, anytime we went anywhere, the movie theater, the grocery store, I mean.
I tell you, it's a great language if your kids don't know it.
Yeah. I use it against us all the time. But the cool thing is my parents they don't fight, because they talk in Lojban right next to you. So you're like, oh, Dad, can I buy a bike today? And he's like, let me ask your mom, blah, 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 blah. And then he's like, yeah, but you need knee pads and a helmet. And you're like, how did you say that within 30 seconds? But they came up with a decision. And so people always came up to us and asked us, they're like, what are your parents speaking? What is that? We're like, oh, it's Lojban. And to us, it was nothing, it wasn't anything different because we grew up with it. But to other people, they just stared at us like we were crazy.
I should say, my daughter learned the word Tiknu, which means daughter. She knew what we were talking about, but she never knew what we were saying. She didn't really learn the language from us. I think it's basically true with both my kids. They didn't learn much of the language. That made it very good for talking about.
We know yes, now, hello, and goodbye.
Plus, we didn't, in particular, you would think that we as founders, we'd have brought them up in Lojban. But they were Russian adoptees, they were already struggling learning English, we weren't going to push them. So that's our reason we didn't introduce them into Lojban. We might otherwise.
Instead, I learned sign language.
To spend any effort in it because they were clear. I mean, and they spoke. I mean, she spoke fluent English within a year in terms of no accent or whatever. But she struggled with academic English for years. We always tease her about how, even in high school, how she never met a vocabulary test that she wouldn't miss half of. And it isn't that she doesn't know English; it's just she can't. Learning English vocabulary in an academic manner, where you look at definitions and memorize it, it's like learning a foreign language for you. You can't do it easily. By using language, she learned anything she uses, she learns. Memorizing vocabulary.
I guess going back to the attitudinals, is there one for sarcasm, and can you use other ones sarcastically? Because when I'm texting, I'll say LOL to someone. Sometimes it will actually mean okay, I'm confused. Sometimes it'll mean I was stupid.
Which could be used to express a certain kind of sarcasm, and you could attach that word for irony to Zoho to say it's humorous irony, as opposed to some deep philosophical irony, which is some other kind.
Part of the problem is, when we designed Lojban as a logical language, we didn't really want people to go and lie in it. And you saying an untruth and marking it, therefore, was kind of.
Well, you have to, you can mark it as ironic, but if you...
But if you mark it, it isn't anymore, right?
Yes. And it turned out that we didn't have to. One of the things that came out of the analysis of the attitudinals, some people tried to analyze the question of, is an attitudinal affect whether the statement is true or not? And the answer should be, at least in theory, no. You express a statement which is either true or false. You attach an attitudinal to it, and that expresses your emotions about it. The language hasn't changed. The meaning hasn't changed. Well, it doesn't always work that way. When you say, I hope it's going to be sunny tomorrow. I hope. It's going to be sunny tomorrow. Now, it's going to be sunny tomorrow is not a true statement if it turns out it's going to be rainy tomorrow. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I'm expressing hope about or something that's true or false in the real world, but I'm expressing hope about something that would be true in some ideal world.
Or possible.
So we call it a possible world. Several of the attitudinals create possible worlds and express your attitude towards them rather than towards the real world. And the world and the language ends up being it's logically can be analyzed in terms of the possible world, but not in terms of the real world. And that gets into idiosyncrasies of logic that nobody really wants to deal with. But you'll find that people will debate them at great length on the Lojban list. There are a lot of things that are debated at great length on the Lojban list that are really abstruse logic principles that really don't affect usage, but they reflect theories of logic and theories of semantics. Somewhere in the question there was a semantic question, and we don't have a formal theory of semantics. If one emerges, well, we'll be happy. Yes.
How does Lojban address discrete abstractions of the color spectrum? For example, if the goal is to be unbiased towards culture, and yet color is a hot topic in your work hypothesis.
Okay, yes. In coming up with the color words, our first point is that, well, Lojban was not invented fresh. We basically we started with what Jim Brown had done with Lojban. So if he has a cultural bias in there, to some extent we inherited it. But I didn't look at the question, and color words became a real question, and because it's something that's so much discussed. And the bottom line is we took a look at there are some language universalists that people have described about color words, that if a language has a word for this, then they have a word for that. And so there's this hierarchy of color words that, an order of priority, that pretty much any language that has 5 color words is going to have these 5. If they have 7 color words, they're going to be these 7. And to cover that, because our whole attitude is to be as inclusive as possible, we said, let's take all the words that are mandatory categories in any language and give them a word, or come up with a word for it so that they can express emotion. You don't have to. If you and our words do not have. We do not define a point on the spectrum that is blue. If you say something is blue, what does it mean? Well, we don't know. If you Russian has 2 blues. Which blue is blue? Well, either one. We don't really say. If you want to talk about, okay, there's this Russian blue that's more like sky blue. Well, it's Ruski Skani London. It's Russian sky blue. That you can do that. You can, if you want to talk about
Ruski cat.
Ruski cat. Yes. I'm sorry. I think you were mentioning Japanese has one of the little terms that doesn't have the other. And if you want to talk about it, you just ponjo, which is Japanese, and you use the word. It means it's going to cover the spectrum of whatever that word means.
And if the recipient of the conversation doesn't know what it is, you can ask.
And you can explain.
And you can get, Lojban words are really wide in meaning for the basic words, and as you add specificity, you can narrow it down.
Would there be a way, such as with the attitudinals, how you can add extra sort of length? Could you say, if you said blue, would you be able to add some sort of, I don't know, argumentizer or something that would shift towards one side or the other?
I would presume. It depends on what kind of. It's not attitudinal, though. You'd actually be modifying it as a. It would be a compound. Like I did a Japanese blue, and you would, what you do to make it a compound, you would actually use the Rossi form, the short form, and append it together and create an entirely new word.
And then you define
And then you define that word to mean whatever it is you wanted. And therefore, if you wanted to have a shifted word, you would, whatever metaphor you came up with, would use tanru, because metaphor is a sloppy word. But whatever you're using to convey which meaning that you're talking about, you would create a compound with this, assign the specific meaning that you intend, which might be very technical in how it's different from the standard meaning, and that's what the word means.
So if you wanted to shift a blue towards the green or something, you could do a blue-green type of blue. So that does kind of say it's a type of blue, but it's towards the blue-green.
And another solution to that, of course, is started like we do with English. You have an olive green. At one time there was a primitive in Lojban for olive, and you could just say olive green, olive green. Now you do something similar to that.
All right. Well, I think we're actually out of time. But if anyone had questions, who wants to stay after, we could have time for some more questions. Time goes by fast. But thank you very much.
Thank you guys all for the questions that we did come up with. It was very useful in preparing for this, because I had some idea of what sorts of things you guys were interested in. Your questions were all well thought out. I couldn't cover them all in this. Somebody asked something about Zizazu, and somebody else asked about the Japanese social indicators.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we actually have one. So yes, we can handle things